Welcome back to Groups. We are in week 12, which means we only have one more week to go in our summer in Scripture. Today I'm here with Kristen Korbler. You serve on our worship team and do a fantastic job. And thanks for joining us in this conversation today.
Thanks for inviting me.
As we are headed into the shipwreck that Paul goes through. Last week we left off with Paul getting this call from God to go to Rome and preach. And what we learn is that he's going to go to Rome, but as an arrested Roman citizen.
Right.
And he takes this trip all throughout the sea into Rome. And it's not an easy journey, we find, as he goes through this shipwreck. So let's take a look at it. I'm going to go ahead and have you read in Acts chapter 27.
Perfect. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Salmone. So at this point, he's hit several different stops. He had to change boats. Like, this might sound like a nice pleasure cruise, but it's not. It's not what we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall, and Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. "Men," he said, "I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well." But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, a poor choice to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure.
All right, so we see Paul, he keeps speaking up. He has to speak up to this officer, and of course the officer doesn't listen to him. The officer and the owner of the boat, they're like, no, like, Paul, you're a tent maker, you're a prisoner, like, get in your lane.
Right.
But he speaks up.
Yeah, he doesn't stop. He knows who he is, and even though he knows that he's not necessarily an expert in this field, he is an expert in his relationship with God, right? And like, he has that communication, and so he knows that if this is what God is speaking to him, then he needs to speak that even if he knows he's not going to be listened to, so that once it comes to a point where somebody is going to listen, they know his voice, right, and they know where he stands.
Right, and I love that. Like, okay, a commanding officer in Paul's eyes is here. The voice of the Lord is here because he's the Lord. And so that's what we see in Paul. Going on a little bit further, it says, the next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until at last all hope was gone. No one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage, none of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood beside me, and he said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island.'" So he keeps speaking up, but he also keeps, I like to call it seeking up, like seeking the Lord. And he finds the Lord in this time of prayer speaking to him.
Right. So there was this opportunity for them to dock, and when they didn't listen, he was like, "Okay, well then, that's your decision. I can't control that. But when the time comes again, I have been again in prayer. I know what the Lord is telling me. And once again, here's this word from the Lord." And it reminds me a lot of the parable of the woman who is coming to the corrupt judge, and she just keeps nagging him, and she's on him, and he can't even sleep because she's constantly on him. And he finally relents just so that she won't keep bothering him. And luckily for us, we serve a loving God who who wants what's best for us and is there when we seek him. So that nagging is not incessant. It is us developing a relationship with God and knowing that when we are in line with what he has planned for us, that it is the best. Even when Paul is heading towards trial, he's not going on a pleasure cruise, like we said earlier. This isn't something that he's going to, end up at Disney World. Yeah. He is going to stand trial, but he knows that even through all of that, God has a plan for him.
Yeah, and it had to have been so frustrating for him too, because all of his other missionary journeys that he has taken, he's been a little bit in control. It's been, I hired these people for this, but he is completely out of control as a prisoner. And so he knows what to do, but there's these other forces and these other people that are a little bit in control. And so I think that's his way too of saying, like, guys, like, let's go God's way here. So that's hard to be in a spot where things are out of your control. And man, is that ever the best time to be seeking the Lord, because he is always in control. Going on to verse 27.
About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, as we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later, they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the soldiers tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your head will perish." Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard.
The thing to remember here is just to keep being known for love. It was so loving for him to be looking out for them. Hey, you haven't eaten. And I love he gets really close to almost sharing communion with them. Like, You're my brothers here. We're gonna commune together and eat before we get rid of this food. And I think it was even loving. He was being so loving even as he was saying, hey, like, nobody's leaving this ship. Like, drop that, because if we leave, this is not going to work out according to what God has told me. And he had no reason to love these people. They're his enemies,
Yeah. I love the imagery of them praying for daybreak, right? And then he says, and day came. Mm-hmm. And so there's even in the midst of this turmoil, because they're still, very much worried about getting dashed up on the rocks. They're not sure what to do. The sailors are trying to escape, but day breaks. Mm-hmm. And then he's like, okay, let's take care of ourselves. Let's move on. And they have bread together. And in the daylight, in that light, they realize what their plan needs to be and are able to enact on that.
Yeah. So even when we're still just going through it, we can cling to those times where.
And I would say even look for those day breaks, right? Because it may be something small. It wasn't an answer to their prayers overall. It wasn't rescue, but it was the next day. And if we can just take it one day at a time, right?
And keep loving and keep showing up and by loving others as we go along. So it says, when morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. They lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed toward shore. But they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. The others held onto planks or debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to shore.
The fact that Paul was who he was the entire time, he spoke to the power that was, stuck to his plans, and then in the end, because of that, because of his trust and the way that he relied on God, he saves not only himself, not only the soldiers and the sailors, but that attitude, that love that he exuded so touched the heart of this commanding officer that he ends up saving all the prisoners. Because just for his sake, just to spare his life, all of the prisoners were spared.
Yeah. Well, I hope as you think about maybe some of the storms that you faced in the past, or maybe even things that you're going through now, that you have the courage to share those experiences, because the more that we share, the more we get to encourage one another. And we do pray for you, and that as you experience those daybreak moments, that you would find yourself more in love with Jesus and more in love with others. As always, be a church that's known for love. Have a great week.